So the Talmud in Tractate Bava Kama, discussing the laws of torts, teaches that there are 4 primary agents that cause damage: the ox, the pit, fire, and what the Talmud calls maveh. Now, the other damagers are unambiguous. We know what an ox is. We know how it causes damage by either trampling things or by goring things. A pit, we understand what a pit is. It's a hole that is dug in the public and things can fall into the pit. A fire, we understand. Fires burn, they spread. So those are the 3 of the 4 agents of damage. But then there's this 4th one called maveh, and it's not so clear what maveh is. The Talmud has a discussion about the identity of maveh. And according to one view, maveh refers to a human being who causes damage. The human being who causes damage. What's odd is why the Talmud used such an obscure word to describe a human being, when there are several other words that are much clearer and much more common. Adam, Ish. We have very common Hebrew words for people, human beings, the Talmud could have used. Now, why would a person be referred to as maveh? What is the connection? So one possible rendering of this word, of maveh, is seeker. The human being is identified as a seeker, as one who seeks. Now, what are we supposed to be seeking? So the prophet Isaiah tells us in chapter 45, verse 15, that you are a God who hides. You are a God who conceals yourself. The founder of the Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov, taught an analogy to explain this verse. He says, picture a father trying to help his son learn how to walk. The father will stand facing his son with his arms outstretched, beckoning his son to walk forward. And as the little boy approaches, stepping tentatively, the father will step backwards in order to encourage the child to keep moving forward. So too, the Baal Shem Tov explained, God sometimes withdraws from us. He hides. And this is not meant as a sign of rejection. Rather, it's to arouse us, to intensify our search for Him, our seeking of God. One of the great puzzles of the Torah is the first of the 10 commandments that were inscribed on the tablets at Mount Sinai. Virtually everyone understands God's declaration that I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. This is a directive to believe in Him. No one reads this statement as simply a statement. We call them the 10 Commandments, and this is the first. And it's understood as the commandment to believe in God. But the problem is, how are we to understand this commandment? Because if someone already believes in God, they don't need to be commanded. So how is this commandment relevant to people who believe in God? What are they supposed to do with this commandment? And if someone does not believe in God, what do they do with this commandment? They can't just proclaim, I believe, if they really don't. People can't just turn on faith like we turn on a water spigot. So how are we to understand this commandment to believe in God? It's difficult to understand both for the believer who doesn't need the commandment and the agnostic or the skeptic or the atheist who doesn't believe. And what are they supposed to do? So the Slonim Rebbe, in his magnum opus, the Nesivos Shalom, explains that the commandment is directing us to seek God. That is the nature of the commandment. It's not a commandment to believe in God. It's a commandment to seek God, to search for God. For the agnostic or the atheist, they should try to come to faith. Again, they don't have to artificially and insincerely proclaim a faith they don't have. Their mitzvah, their commandment, is to try, is to seek, to search for God. Perhaps study some books or watch some lectures on why faith in God is reasonable. Perhaps interview some people about why they believe in God. Maybe follow the advice of the Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud in Tractate Chagiga 1:7 has God saying, better that they abandon me, but follow my laws. God is saying, better that people don't believe in me, but at least follow my laws. Because the Talmud explains that through following God's laws, they may be inspired to come and embrace God. The Torah assures us in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29, that if we seek God, we will find him if we search for him with all of our heart and all of our soul. Rav Saadia Gaon composed a meditative prayer along these lines. He wrote, O God, who is concealed from the eyes of all living things, who is sublime and wonderful beyond sight of all creatures, the many heavens cannot contain you, but all those who seek you can find you in their hearts, and all those who meditate upon you can find you in their thoughts. That's how this commandment is relevant to the agnostic or to the atheist. Seek God. Search for him. And how is the first commandment relevant to those who already believe in God? They don't need to be commanded. How is this commandment relevant to them? So the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat 31a describes the final exam that we will be given after we graduate from life on planet Earth and we are meeting our Maker. And one of the questions on our final exam will be, Nasata v'natata be'emuna. And this is usually understood as, did you deal honestly and faithfully in business? Nasata v'natata be'emuna. Did you deal in your business dealings honestly and faithfully? However, the holy Sanzer Rebbe had a different way of spinning this question. He understood it as, did you do business with your faith? Not did you conduct your business faithfully, did you do business with your faith? What does that mean? So we know that when people have money, they don't just let the money sit somewhere. People want their money to grow. They have $10,000, they don't put it under their mattress and it'll stay $10,000 in a year from now. They want that $10,000 to grow. They will seek advice. They will invest. They will talk to people. They will try to find out, how can I make this money grow? And so the Sanzer Rebbe says that is the question that we will be asked. Did you do business with your faith? Did you seek to deepen your faith? Did you seek to grow your faith? That is the way in which the believer is able to relate to the first of the 10 commandments. The believer does not need to be commanded to believe, but they can be directed to work on their faith, to deepen their faith, to try to get their faith to grow. On the verse from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29 that we saw previously, which says, "You shall seek God, and you will find him, but you must search for him with all of your heart," the Kotzker Rebbe explained that even after you have come to faith in God, even after you have found God, you must continue to seek him wholeheartedly, because God is infinite. You may think you have discovered him, but there's always so much more to encounter. And so this is how the believer relates to the first of the commandments. You believe? That's great. Now grow your faith, increase your faith, deepen your faith. Now in the beginning of the book of Exodus, in chapter 6, verse 3, God tells us, "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Now this text is unambiguous, it's not mysterious. We understand exactly what the Torah is saying. God appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. We don't think at this point we need commentaries to come and explain what the text means. However, inexplicably, Rashi, the famous French Bible commentator from 1,000 years ago, felt compelled to comment here. Why in the world would he have to say anything? We know exactly what the verse means. And not only is it strange in and of itself that Rashi comments, but his comment itself, what he says, leaves us totally perplexed and puzzled. Almost impossible to understand what Rashi is coming to tell us. So on the phrase which says, "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob," Rashi says, "El ha'avot," to the patriarchs. To the patriarchs? Why would Rashi have to tell us here in the 6th chapter of the book of Exodus that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs? We know this clearly from the first book in the Bible, from the book of Genesis. We don't need Rashi to come and tell us now all of a sudden that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are avot, are the patriarchs. This comment of Rashi is so bewildering that some commentaries to Rashi say, maybe it's a printer's error. Maybe this is just a mistake. But other commentaries to Rashi explain the incredible depth of Rashi's comment. Because the word avot doesn't only mean fathers or patriarchs. The word ava in Hebrew means to want or to desire. And therefore Rashi is not telling us who God appeared to. That is not a mystery. The verse is very clear. God says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So when Rashi says to the Avot, he's not telling us who God appeared to. He's telling us, why did God appear to them? Why did God appear to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob? Because they were Avot. They were people who wanted me. They desired me. They sought me. And that's why he appeared to them. King David was also such a person who passionately wanted God in his life. And he writes about this many times in the book of Psalms. For example, in Psalm 38, verse 10, David says, all my desire is for you. In Psalm 42, David says, as the deer longs for brooks of water, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. In Psalm 63, David again repeats, my soul thirsts for you. And what's important to understand about Psalm 63 is that it tells us that David was in the desert. David was in the desert. What are people thirsting for in the desert? They're thirsty for water. And yet David cries out that his soul thirsts for God. In Psalm 73, verse 25, David says, whom do I have in the heavens? And I desire nothing besides you. Now, the first leader of the Lubavitch Chabad movement in Hasidus was Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, referred to as the Alter Rebbe. And once he was deeply immersed in his prayers, and he was overheard saying something that David could have said. He said, God, I want nothing. I don't want your Garden of Eden. I don't want your world to come. All I want is you alone. Now, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who was a great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, was one of the most profound Hasidic teachers. His writings have breathtaking depth and complexity. But toward the end of his short 39 years in this world, he began to feel that his lessons were not penetrating the hearts of his students. So he began telling stories, wonderful parables, to convey his vital lessons. And one of his most famous tales is about the lost princess. The story is about a king who has 6 sons and 1 daughter, and this daughter is very precious to the king. He loves her deeply. But one day he grew angry with her, and that night she went to her room, and in the morning she was gone, and no one knew what happened to her. The king was very distraught and tried to find her, but to no avail. And so the king's viceroy went out searching for the princess. And the story recounts his tireless search, until he finally comes upon a castle. And inside he sees a king sitting with the crown on his head, and the king requested that the queen be brought into him. When she's brought in, the viceroy takes one look at her, and he sees this is the princess, the lost princess. He meets with her and he asks her, how can he get her out of this place? She's basically captive here. And she said, it will not be possible. You will not be able to get me out of this place unless you find a place for yourself and remain there for a year. And the princess then says to the viceroy, all of that year you must long to free me. Whenever you are unoccupied, you must only yearn and seek and look forward to freeing me. Unfortunately, in the story, things don't work out after that year, and he goes through many years of vicissitudes before finding her again, and she once again tells him that he has to find a place for himself and to stay there for a year. And she warns him this time that at the end of his fast, because he will have to fast during this time, she warns him on the last day of his fast, he should not drink any wine, otherwise he'll fall asleep. And unfortunately, in the story, he unwittingly drinks some wine and ends up sleeping for 70 years. The princess was growing desperate because she wanted to be rescued from this palace and reunited with her father. When the viceroy finally awakens after his long sleep, he resumes his search, and Rabbi Nachman recounts the incredible adventures that he goes through. I'm not going to rehearse all of that with you here. It's a long story. But at the end, after many more years, he finally again tracks down the princess, and he manages to rescue her. There are many interpretations of this fantastic tale, but most see it as a parable about the rescue of our souls that get trapped and lost in this world. Yaakov Klein authored an in-depth analysis of the lost princess that he called The Story of Our Lives. And he has an entire chapter focusing on the condition that the princess set for the viceroy when she said that during his year-long isolation, he has to long to free her, and he must constantly yearn to accomplish this. In his other writings, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov explains that yearning is not simply a means to an end. It's not only an emotion that can facilitate the accomplishment of some other goal. Rabbi Nachman writes that yearning is precious in and of itself. When someone is drowning in the superficialities and temptations of our material world, and they let out a deep sigh, expressing their desire to escape from the rat race and reconnect with the Almighty. Rabbi Nachman says, in the eyes of God, it was worth creating the entire world just for this sigh. The Zohar teaches that even if a holy desire doesn't materialize into concrete action, it is still treasured by the Creator. The very feeling of yearning and desire to improve one's life and grow closer to the Almighty is invaluable. According to Kabbalistic teaching, a person's faculty of desire is considered to be the loftiest part of who they are. It transcends the realm of our emotions. It transcends the intellectual realm as well. And even if we are not able to authentically express a desire for closeness to God, we can always express a desire to have this desire of being attached to God. The desire for the desire. Unfortunately, people often see very little value in spiritual longing. An inner voice derides this as a waste of time. Something as simple as merely expressing desire is far too easy to have a true effect on our spirituality, we tell ourselves. But this inner voice is not coming from a holy place. It's the voice of our Yetzer Hara, our inner adversary. In the story, the princess understands that yearning for holiness is not a waste of time. It is precisely what should infuse our time and represents the very purpose of creation. Another Hasidic master who discusses spiritual desire is Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev in his masterpiece, The Kedushas Levi. In synagogues outside of the land of Israel, this week's Torah portion, the Torah portion we're going to read this week, this coming Shabbat, is Baha'alosecha. And the Torah discusses in this Torah portion how the Levites came to replace the firstborn Israelites as those whose lives would be dedicated to serving God in the Holy Temple. Chapter 8 in the book of Numbers, verse 16, however, is a verse that appears peculiar. Literally, it says the following: "For they are given to me from among the children of Israel in place of those who are firstborn." Obviously, the beginning of this verse seems redundant. They are given to me from among the children of Israel. So Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev explains that the service that will be performed by the Levites is not what demonstrates that they were given over to God. What God counts as indicating whether people are really His are not the great things they do. It's not going to be the service of the Levites. What is considered a true gift to God is the fact that the Levites give themselves over to God. The fact that they are fully devoted to serving God with passion and desire, that is more precious to God than their actual service in the temple. The most important element of serving God is the yearning, the longing, and the desire to be close with Him. What is truly pleasing to our Father in heaven is not simply carrying out His commands. He's looking for more than that. The Almighty examines our hearts to see where the person really was when they were performing His commandments. Did the person's observance flow from a deep yearning and desire to fulfill the will of their Maker and connect with Him? If so, that's what God treasures. When our patriarch Jacob sent his son Joseph out to find his brothers. The brothers were out taking care of the flocks. And Jacob sent Joseph to go find them. The Torah tells us a little detail in the story in Genesis chapter 37, verse 15, that a man encountered Joseph as he was wandering in the field. He might have been lost. He might have really not known where his brothers were. And a man encounters Joseph and asks Joseph, "What are you seeking?" And the sages of the Talmud inform us that this man was none other than the angel Gabriel. And according to the Hasidic master, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, the angel's words were a lesson about our relationship with God. As we go through life, we should always ask ourselves, what am I seeking? What am I really looking for in life? Because this defines who we are. Are we searching for God or for something else? If we are always seeking after God, we will fulfill the purpose for which we came into the world. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov used to say, a person is not what he knows, a person is not what he does, a person is what he longs for, a person is what he desires. Now, during the festival of Sukkot, what is referred to in English as the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Holy Temple stood in Jerusalem, very large boughs of willows would be leaned up against the altar, and the priests would circle the altar each day of the holiday. Once they would circle the altar. On Hosana Raba, which was the 6th day of the festival, they would circle the altar 7 times. The Midrash compares this to the priests who circled Jericho in the days of Joshua. They circled Jericho once each day, and on the 7th day, they encircled the city 7 times. And then we are told that the walls of the city sunk into the ground. At a wedding ceremony, the bride circles the groom under the wedding canopy, and she circles the groom 7 times. And when she does this, it breaks all barriers. The couple achieves a state of oneness with no walls separating them. Similarly, Hoshana Rabbah is the highest level of our closeness between God and Israel. The Talmud in Tractate Sukkah 44a tells us something interesting about these circuits around the altar on Hoshana Rabbah. The Talmud says that on this day, priests with physical blemishes and deformities that would normally be disqualified from participating in the temple services, these handicapped priests would join with the other priests as they paraded around the altar. Hundreds of years after the Second Temple was destroyed and the major Jewish communities were located in Bavel in Babylonia, we're told that one of the great sages at that time, Rav Hai Gaon, would go up to Jerusalem from Bavel for the holiday of Sukkot each year. And on Hoshana Rabbah, he would encircle the Mount of Olives 7 times. And afterwards, those who accompanied him would recite the songs that he had prepared. Walking about 200 feet ahead of Rav Hai Gaon were priests dressed in capes and gold-embroidered silk tunics, and the rest of the crowd followed around 200 feet behind him. One year during the procession, Rav Hai Gaon was seen to be laughing, and afterward, during the meal, he seemed to be in a very joyous state of mind. So at the end of the meal, there was someone there, a penitent murderer, someone who had committed murder but repented. He approached Rav Hai Gaon and asked him, "Rebbe, why did you walk alone when we were all walking around the Mount of Olives?" And Rav Hai answered him, "Each year I come up to Jerusalem from Bavel so I could encircle the Mount of Olives on the holiday of Sukkot. I purify myself for the occasion, and on Hosana Raba, Elijah the prophet accompanies me and converses with me. This is why the assembly keeps a distance before me and behind me. I don't want people overhearing my conversation with Elijah the prophet." And he said, "This year I asked Elijah, 'When will the Messiah come?' And Elijah responded, 'When you will encircle the Mount of Olives with priests.'" So Rav Hai Gaon continued explaining, "So I gathered all the priests I was able to locate to accompany me as I went around the Mount of Olives. Perhaps there'll be one really true priest among them. And later Elijah said to me, 'You see all the priests here, dressed in elegant garments and walking peacefully? None of them is from the seed of Aaron, except for one sole straggler who walks behind the rest. He's looked upon with contempt by the others, and he's insignificant in his own eyes. He walks with tattered clothing, this priest, and he seeks no honor, and he walks in an unassuming manner. He's lame in one leg, and on his other side, he's blind in his eye.' Elijah said, 'This one is the true priest from the seed of Aaron.' And Rav Hai Gaon then concluded, telling this penitent murderer, 'By my life, this is why I laughed. Among the entire group, there was not a single genuine priest except for that one handicapped man.'" We see from this story that even though the handicapped priest was not able to conduct any service in the Holy Temple, his role in the Hoshana Rabbah procession holds the key to the ultimate redemption. This was the message of Elijah the prophet. The true priest will be the one that will herald the Messiah. Now, during our processions in our synagogues on Hoshana Rabbah, we hold willows. The willow is one of the 4 species that we take during the festival of Sukkot. The other species are the myrtles, palm branches, and the citron, the esrog. The citron fruit has both taste and fragrance, and represents Jews with both Torah wisdom and good deeds. The myrtle has smell but no taste. The palm tree has taste but no fragrance. And these 2 species represent those who have either Torah wisdom or good deeds, but not both. But the willow has neither. The willow has neither smell nor taste. And the willow symbolizes people that are lacking both Torah and good deeds. But the willow is not superfluous. In the Midrash, God says, "Let all 4 species be held together and provide atonement for one another." So the willow did not only receive from the other species, the willow is able to provide for the other species as well. In the Torah, the willow is described as Arvei Nachal, willows of the brook. This particular willow that grows by the water has an unquenchable thirst for water, and it thrives where water is abundant. In our mystical literature, water is associated with desire. Water is associated with desire. The desire of water may be associated with the second day of creation, when God separated the upper waters from the lower waters. From that time, all earthly waters have the desire to rejoin the upper waters so they can be closer to the Creator. The Midrash teaches that when they were separated, the lower waters cried out to God, "Why have we been distanced from your heavenly throne?" And God promised the waters that they would be elevated during the service when there is libations of water on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem during the holiday of Sukkot. During the holiday of Sukkot, there's a Nisuch HaMayim. There's the libations of water that are poured on the altar. And God is saying, you, water, will be elevated spiritually in this service. Just like the waters that felt deprived when they were separated from the upper waters, when any pure heart is denied access to divine service, it too has a deep longing to be restored. And the handicapped Kohen, the handicapped priest, personifies this idea. We know that priests did not work. They didn't engage in commerce or agriculture like the rest of the nation. They were supported by the tithes of the rest of the people so they could be fully devoted to serving God and to working in the temple. Imagine the plight of a young Kohen, a young priest, who develops a physical blemish or a defect and is subsequently disqualified from serving in the temple. While this may be crushing, there is one emotion that is not compromised by his disability, and that is his longing and his desire. He looks forward all year to the holiday of Sukkot, when he'll be able to join with the other priests in circling around the altar on Hosana Raba. This is a moment that he would dream about all year long. And even though the unfit priests were the minority, most of the priests going around the altar were not people with handicaps. But even though the unfit priests were the minority in the procession, the Talmud refers to this ritual as the service of the handicapped priest. Some commentaries explain that the 7 circuits around the altar that we make on Hoshana Rabbah correspond to the 7 heavens. There are 7 levels in heaven. And the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga 12b teaches that the highest heaven is called Aravos, Aravos are willows. And above this level is God's throne of glory. Our sages also teach that this heaven has an abundance of water, and that the spiritual water, this spiritual water in the highest level of heaven, will be used by God in the future to resurrect the dead. Amazingly, we are told that when the priests circled the altar, they prayed for the salvation of Israel and the salvation of God. Now, what does this mean, that they prayed for the salvation of God? So we on earth long to be reunited with God. We seek to be close to God. And this desire, so to speak, is reciprocated above. God as well does not want to be separated from his people. He wants to dwell among us. But there's an obvious problem with this prayer. Remember that it was recited in the Holy Temple when we lived peacefully on our land, and God's Shekhinah, God's holy presence, was with us. What are we talking about? That we are praying for God's salvation, that God should be united with the people. What kind of salvation was necessary when the Holy Temple stood in Jerusalem? Rabbi Israel Greenwald suggested that perhaps God's longing is for mankind's ultimate redemption. Israel was okay, but we know that God doesn't only want to dwell among Israel. The prophet Isaiah describes that ultimately the entire world will be full of the knowledge of God as the waters cover the seas. Psalm chapter 68, verse 5 describes God as a rochev ba'aravot. This is usually translated as riding upon the highest heaven. We saw before that the seventh level of heaven is called aravot. But aravot are willows, as we've seen. And we could suggest that God's glory is upheld by willow Jews, people who may lack great accomplishments, but what they have is a burning desire for God, and they long yearningly for him. The four species have to be taken together because each one is valuable. Even the humble willow, it appears lowly, but it is really quite exalted. At the end of our Hosana Raba service, when we walk around our synagogues 7 times on Hosana Raba, we take willows and we beat them on the ground. But afterward, they are placed on top of the holy ark of our synagogues that house our Torah scrolls. The true place of our holy longings and yearnings is in the highest levels of heaven.